All right, so we move on in chapter 4. We're done now with actually collecting samples, and we're going to shift our focus from just sample collecting to actual experiments. So once you have your sample of people, you pretty much have two choices. You can either ask them a question of some kind, or you can perform an experiment on your sample of people. And so we're going to look at how to tell the difference between both of those today. So our first kind of definition we need to outline is observational study, which is exactly what it sounds like. You basically just gather a bunch of individuals and observe their behavior. You don't do anything to them. You don't attempt to influence them in any way. You simply look at their behavior. And you can do that present tense, past tense, and future tense, sort of. So we'll explain that a little bit. So an observational study observes individuals, shocker, I know, and measures variables of interest, but does not attempt to influence results. So basically, an observational study is just collecting data that already exists or watching data as it happens to exist. Oopsie. So, hey, go away. Okay, there we go. Or watching data as it happens. So, for example, if I were interested in, I don't know, knowing who people were going to vote for in the next election, I might take a random sample and ask them. I'm not attempting to influence who they're going to vote for. I'm just simply asking them. So here's the deal with observational studies. They're pretty coolish, sort of. They're sort of the best way to get certain types of data. And as long as the sample used for the study is representative, then you can conclude something called association, which is the same association as we looked at last chapter. So, no. So as long as your sample is representative, oh my gosh, you can conclude association. So here's what we mean by that. Well, we'll look at an example. So it says, a study was conducted in which a stratified random sample of U.S. adults was taken. The individuals in the sample were asked the following question. How often do you eat chocolate? Almost never, sometimes, often, or very often. Each person's health history was also asked for, and the results of the study showed that people who responded very often were also the most likely to be generally healthy. What can you conclude from this study? Okay. So the temptation here is to say, okay, well, they asked people how much they ate chocolate. The group that ate chocolate very often was also the most healthy. And so your temptation after reading the study is to be like, okay, well, eating chocolate makes you healthy, causes you to be healthy. And as we learned in the last chapter, that's not necessarily true. Causation and correlation are not the same thing. Just because there's correlation does not mean there's causation. So here's what you can conclude. So first of all, was this sample fairly representative? I'm going to argue yes, it was. And the reason why I'm going to argue that is because of why. What kind of a sample was taken? A stratified random sample. Stratified random sample is a perfectly acceptable random sample. And if our sample is random, then it should hopefully be representative. Oh my gosh. Okay. So let's write that down. So because computer is not cooperating today. So because a stratified random sample was taken, we can assume the sample is representative of whom? So who did they take this sample of? It says they took a stratified random sample of U.S. adults. So this stratified random sample should be representative of the population it came from, which is U.S. adults. Okay. Not only that, but after they did the study, they determined that the very often chocolate eating group also tended to be generally healthy, which means we can conclude that there is a connection somehow between eating a bunch of chocolate and being generally healthy. So we can also conclude there is an association between chocolate consumption and being generally healthy. And actually, as far as what we can conclude, that's it. You can't really conclude any more than that. Like I said, the temptation is to assume that chocolate causes someone to be healthy, but we don't know that. Because this was an observational study, we didn't know what else went into this. You know, maybe the generally healthy people are generally healthy because they exercise, and maybe because they exercise, they eat more, and so they're more likely to consume chocolate than the average person. We don't know. And because we don't know, we cannot conclude that chocolate consumption causes good health. Okay, so I take a sample, I ask this particular sample a question, I figure out their chocolate consumption, and I look at their health records and determine if they're healthy. I notice there is a connection between chocolate consumption and being generally healthy, but that's as far as my study is allowed to go. I can conclude there's a connection, I can't conclude that there's causation. So, all right. Is there anything in this world that I can do to conclude causation? Because Brisa, you preached at us last unit that correlation does not imply causation. So is there anything we can do to show, for example, that chocolate consumption causes you to be healthy? Well, yeah, there is. And actually, it's very simple. All you have to do is do an experiment. As long as you do a good experiment, then depending on the results of the experiment, you can conclude causation. That is perfectly okay. To be clear though, an experiment as we define it in stats is going to imply that there's been some kind of treatment. In an observational study, you're not doing anything to influence responses. In an experiment, you're certainly trying to influence responses. You're giving treatments, you're trying different things to measure responses. So you are messing with the people that you took your sample from. That is the point of an experiment. So an experiment deliberately imposes some kind of treatment on individuals. And the whole point of that is to measure their response. And then, of course, well-designed experiments are the only way, statistically, to establish causation. All right. So we're going to talk about what makes a well-designed experiment a little bit later. You guys are going to kind of play with that a little bit. So to begin, though, we got to define a couple of vocabulary terms, nothing crazy. But parts of an experiment you need to know are the following. And actually, there have been a bunch of AP questions that part of them, like part A, part B, whatever, will just ask you to identify each of the following terms. So the first one is explanatory variable or factors. And that is something that we are thinking is going to cause some kind of a response. This is the thing in general that we are testing. So in the example above, if I wanted to show that chocolate consumption causes good health, chocolate consumption here is going to be my explanatory variable. That is causing the good health. So explanatory variable, it's also called a factor, is something that is thought to cause a response. This is what we're testing. This is the whole point of the experiment. Okay. So that's our explanatory variable. Our response variable is kind of what it was last unit. It's what are you measuring? What are you measuring after the treatment is given? So again, in our chocolate example, what I'm trying to see is if health was improved. So health would be the response variable. So health is what is measured. Or sorry, not health, excuse me. Response variable is what is measured specifically. After treatment is given. Okay. Treatment, it's exactly what it sounds like. And treatment is going to be a more specific form of your explanatory variable usually. So treatment we're going to define as a specific condition, because it doesn't necessarily have to be a drug or I don't know, something you're doing to someone. It could just be putting them in a certain situation. That could count as a treatment. So specific condition applied to an individual in an experiment. And this might be the explanatory variable or a more specific form of it. So this may be the explanatory variable. They might be exactly the same thing. Or it could be more specific. So here's what I mean by that. In the example above, my explanatory variable is chocolate consumption. So for my treatment, I'm not just going to say, okay, go eat chocolate. I'm going to be specific. So I might have one group not eat chocolate, just so I can compare a little bit. I might have another group eat like a little bit of chocolate. So maybe, I don't know, like 1 gram of chocolate a week. I might have a different group do 5 grams of chocolate a week. I don't know. But the point is, treatment's going to be connected certainly to your explanatory variable. It just usually is a little more specific. If I'm trying to test a drug, if I want to see if aspirin is more effective than Tylenol, then my explanatory variables are aspirin versus Tylenol. And when I actually do my experiment, I will be giving aspirin and Tylenol to a group of individuals. And then finally, those group of individuals who I am experimenting on, or what I'm experimenting on, are called experimental units, or if they're people, we call them subjects. So it's what or who receives the treatment. So if I'm experimenting on people, we don't call them experimental units. We call them subjects. If I'm experimenting on trees, we call those experimental units. They're not subjects. Cool? Excellent. All right. So we are going to look at sort of a giant example and kind of go through and look at what we kind of know so far. And then lastly, we're going to talk about something a little crazy called confounding. So let's check out this next example. Go ahead and read it to yourself. And when you are ready, try to see if you can do part A. It's just going to ask you to identify the 4 terms we just looked at. So experimental units, explanatory variable, response variable, and treatments. So go ahead and read through example 2. The questions A, B, and C are on the, or A and B, excuse me, are on the back. So pause this, read through, and then we'll check back in just a little bit. Okay. Oh wait, pause again. Okay, there we go. So in part A, they wanted you to identify the experimental units, explanatory variable, or variables if there's more than one, response variables, and the treatment of this particular experiment. So in this case, the experimental units are who or what was receiving the treatment. And so you may disagree with this, kind of takes a while to get the hang of it, but I would argue the experimental units are the schools themselves. And it's actually sometimes easiest to start with actually the treatment, because that's usually pretty obvious from what they explained. So think of it this way. Our treatment was either the school had the Career Start program or they didn't. They didn't do anything. And so the question becomes, who is receiving the treatment? And the who in this case is the school, the whole school. So in this case, the reason why I'm saying the schools are the experimental units is because that's who or what received the treatment. Now, of course, we know the school implies the students at those schools were using the program, but the experimental unit was the school. The explanatory variable in general is how relevant subjects in school are to students. They want to try to measure if these subjects are relevant or not. They want to try to add in relevance in the real world. And so they're looking for relevance. That's the general explanatory variable. Now, I just picked how relevant subjects in school are to students. You might have said connections between real life and school. Anything that's sort of going towards that is fine for the explanatory variable. Remember, explanatory variable is going to usually be pretty general. Response variable. This is in the experiment what they actually measured. And it says that they followed the group of students and then gathered data on school attendance, test scores, level of engagement, and graduation rate. And so in this case, we had multiple response variables, and it's precisely what they listed. So response variable is very, very specific. Treatment is very, very specific. And then, of course, the treatment was either the school used the Career Start program or it did not. So the 2 treatments were Career Start program or nothing, which has us go into, the next, oh my gosh. The next question. Oh, really? We're going to do this right now? Okay. So it has us go into the next question, which I'll put up in a second. But it says, why were 7 of the schools randomly assigned to Career Start? Why not just use Career Start with the schools from low-income neighborhoods and call it a day? So again, pause, answer that if you haven't already, come up with an idea, and then we'll chat. Okay. Sorry, people, pen is not working, so this is going to be choppy, but go with me here. So the question is, why were 7 of the schools randomly assigned to use Career Start? Why not just use Career Start with the schools from low-income neighborhoods? So meaning, why not, so if we know Career Start is designed to help students in low-income neighborhoods, why not just give all the low-income neighborhoods Career Start, and then the other schools don't give them anything, and then see how the 2 schools compare. And so let's talk about what would happen if they were to do that. So if the researchers had only the low-income schools use Career Start, they might not be able to determine results from the experiment. So here's what we mean. So let's say that I did do this experiment and I did give Career Start to only the low income schools and I didn't do anything for the high income schools. At the end of the day, what am I measuring? I'm measuring school attendance, test scores, level of engagement, and graduation rate. The unfortunate truth of our society at this point is when you have a high income school, those schools tend to have better test scores, better attendance, better graduation rates, etc. So let's say I did this experiment and I gave Career Start to only the low income schools. Well, at the end of the day, what if, for example, the low-income schools still didn't do as well in school attendance, test scores, level of engagement, and graduation rate as the high-income schools? Then what am I going to conclude? Well, I'm going to conclude Career Start didn't work, when in reality, maybe it did work. What I should be looking at is I should be looking at low-income schools with Career Start and low-income schools without Career Start. And if there's a clear difference in those two groups, then I can conclude Career Start works. Whereas if I just look at Career Start with the low-income schools and no treatment with the high-income schools, then I might assume Career Start doesn't work because the low-income schools are still not matching the high-income schools, when in reality, maybe that just isn't going to happen anyway, just because of the low-income nature of the schools versus the high-income nature of the schools. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. In this case, if I'm testing, and just in general, if I'm testing a treatment, I want to test it on the same group, if you will. So I don't want to just test my treatment on high and low income. I want to make sure I focus on low income and test this treatment on some low income and then give the other low income schools no treatment so that I can actually compare. Because if I have a situation like this, then I might wrongly conclude Career Start doesn't work when in reality maybe it is effective, maybe it does help. And so when this happens, whenever I have a badly designed experiment, which in this case, if I had done this, that would be a bad experiment, then I can have something occur called confounding. Okay. So our final kind of piece here is to talk about something called confounding. Confounding is sort of a weird idea, but here's sort of how it goes. So confounding occurs kind of like in the last example when two variables are associated in such a way that their effects on the response variable can't be distinguished. So let's write that down. So it occurs when two variables are associated in such a way that their effects cannot be distinguished. Observational studies actually are riddled usually with confounding. In fact, the chocolate example that I gave you guys before, I kind of brought up the idea of confounding, which is why for observational studies, I can conclude there's a connection, but I can't conclude that there's causation. So for example, in our study that we discussed earlier, chocolate consumption may not actually be the cause of good health. Chocolate consumption and good health both might be responses to something else, like an active lifestyle. So an active lifestyle could explain why people eat more chocolate, because maybe they just eat more in general, and also why they're healthy. An active lifestyle also usually makes one more healthy. So that's an example of confounding, where when I know there's a connection between two variables, but there's no way for me to tell if one variable caused the other thing. So we'll look at a couple examples of that. Well, one example, and then you will have your homework. But so that you don't forget. So observational studies and bad experiments often fail To show an explanatory variable causes a response variable because of confounding. Okay, so let's look at an example of that. So do smaller class sizes in elementary school really benefit student learning? We might do an observational study that compares students who happen to be in smaller and larger classes in their early years. Identify a variable that might cause confounding with the effects of smaller class sizes and explain how confounding might occur. So I'll give you a second to kind of try this on your own, but here's sort of a breakdown of this in case that didn't make a ton of sense. So one big argument in schools is class size. And the argument is smaller classes are better for students, which sort of intuitively makes sense. But let's talk. If I just went and grabbed a random sample of high school students and said, hey, focus on second grade. How big was your second grade class? How many kids were in it? Kids are going to respond with various answers. And so I might get 30, I might get 25, I might get 15, depending on where the kid went to school. And what I would do if it were me researching this is I would put the kids in categories and say, okay, small class size, medium class size, large class size. And then what I might do is I might look at each of those kids' GPAs, and I might try to see if the smaller class size group maybe had a higher GPA than the larger class size group. So that's what they're talking about. That would be an observational study. So think about the situation I've just sort of explained, and maybe identify a variable that might lead to confounding with the effects of smaller class sizes. So meaning, let's say I do find that the smaller class sizes, the kids who were in 10 or 15 sized classrooms do have higher GPAs. I want to know what else could have caused that. So what else is associated with smaller class size and GPA that would actually cause confounding in that situation? So go ahead and pause, try to write an explanation, try to discuss it if nothing else, and then we'll chat. Okay, so you might have come up with a bunch of different things. Here's sort of what I came up with. If yours makes sense too, then you're probably right. That's the joy of confounding variables. So in a study like this, we may find students from smaller classes tend to do better in school, potentially. However, if we found that could be due to the fact that private schools tend to be smaller than public schools. So meaning, if I actually asked a bunch of kids this, more than likely, if your second grade class had 10 kids in it, you probably went to some kind of a charter or a private school or something. And so if that was the case, then, all right, let's say you do have a really high GPA. Is it because your class size was small, or is it because you went to a private school when you were little? And I'm not saying it's one or the other. What I am saying is it would be impossible to tell. I don't know if it's the class size, and I don't know if it's the private school. No idea. And because of that, that's a picture of confounding. I just simply don't know which of those variables caused the other. Now, along with that, if we're connecting class size and all that to GPA, let's say that smaller class sizes were associated with private schools. Well, who goes to private schools? Well, wealthy people do. And unfortunately, wealth is a pretty stinking good indicator of GPA, unfortunately, and education as well. So more than likely, you have students who are wealthy going to private schools with small class sizes, and then you have everybody else going to public schools. And at the end of the day, again, perhaps wealth could be a confounding variable. And again, you wouldn't have any idea whether the wealth and sort of that affluent lifestyle caused a student to have a high GPA, or if it was class size. So there's a million different types of confounding variables here. Here's a picture, though, of what is not a confounding variable in this situation. So if I found that students from smaller classes tended to do better, if your explanation went something like this, well, yeah, because small class sizes are better for students because there's fewer students for the teacher to help so the teacher can get around to more kids. That is not explaining a confounding variable. That is not explaining confounding at all. All you're doing is you're trying to back up class size as the explanatory variable. That is not confounding. Now, you may be right. Class size may absolutely be incredibly helpful and may lead to higher GPAs, but if you are specifically asked to explain confounding, you need to explain why class size might not be the only explanation. Okay? So beware when you're asked to explain confounding. That does not mean to back up the result in the experiment. It means to question. It means to say, okay, I know your experiment found that, but what about this? This could have caused that too. So that's the idea of confounding. What else could explain what happened in the experiment? Or what else could have explained what happened in the observational study? Okay? So be careful of that. Beware of that when you look at homework and tests and all of that. When they ask you to explain confounding, come up with another explanation for what happened that's not explained in the problem. Don't just back up whatever the problem is saying. That is another discussion for another day. All right, y'all. Sorry if this was a little jumbled, but enjoy. Have a lovely day.